what I call the second generation. We have extensions of some of these paradigms, which actually define what, from the point of view of the authors of this system, was the purpose of a digital edition of this second generation, understanding itself as a project which looks at the then future, the internet, for the very consistent use of the term hypertext, which has practically disappeared from the theoretical discussion since about 2000, shows that it's still very much rooted in older concepts. That is just assumption, whether that may have been the end result of some of these editions of the second generation. Now, let me talk a bit about the next few years, and let me do that very much more personally, because I would like to describe why there is something which worries me a bit. So the next 5 to 6 minutes are a very personal and private story without any attempt at being a reference base. In 1996, I started a project which tried to do two things. The internet presence, unfortunately, is currently not available because it's migrated somewhere else. I'm not connected to the institutions anymore. But what we tried to do, what in 1996 was a relatively stiff achievement, was to put a whole set of documents from an archive onto the internet, something like 70,000 pages, for a few moments larger than the George Washington stuff, which tries to depict the whole archive in the internet, map the structure of the archive, make it accessible by various relatively traditional ways of how to organize a digital archive, and go right through to the digital representation of the content. When we started that project, I thought that I would do so to follow up on some work which I had done during the preceding years. Part of that was, for example, that since 89 or so, I had personally experimented with handling of digitized manuscripts, where, for example, we looked at such possibilities like making erased characters readable. So when I thought, you create a project now where historians can work with 70,000 manuscripts, the result would be that we would have wonderful material to see how you could use all these tools in practice. We may have made one mistake because we thought we should be in constant feedback with the users. So we invited something like, in one case it was 80, more typically 50, archivists and historians to discuss the project as it evolved over 3 years. And reacting to what our users wanted to do, we more or less forgot all about that. Because the sheer fascination that the material would be available on the internet, and you could look at it without going to the archive, was so much more interesting for the historical users that they had no interest at all what you actually could do digitally with the material. And the archivists were so much concerned about how to keep some control over the stuff, or find arguments why it should not leave the archive, that they also were not really interested what happened to the stuff once the decision was made to make it available. From my point of view, by the way, I also had another illusion. The second illusion was that if you make digital material available, this would be an ideal platform to work on editorial stuff. So while this was one part of the project, the second part of the project was to look at tools which would make it easier to make traditional editorial tasks easier to achieve. With the assumption we start here and at the same time we show some vision where it could go. So we thought it was a very nice idea to integrate some model for dynamic editions into that. A dynamic edition, that's a small prototype of the stuff which Malte Rehbein, whom you may have encountered in editorial circles now in the meantime, was a prototype of a way to present texts in digital form where you would not focus on the archetype, but where you would have the possibility to click at any of the other witnesses and have all of them represented just as you can represent the archetype. And that was one of the good ideas we thought we had at that time, which tries to show how specific the text is. The darker the color is, the more unique it is. That is, the smaller the number of texts is from which it is derived. What came out of that? The digital library part was a smashing success. Based on that, we then continued to put a monastic library onto the internet in fairly high resolutions. And I'm not quite sure whether I'm proud or vain, but that was the system which drove the first generation of the e-codices, which you may know in the meantime is the one manuscript library which tries to make the complete medieval manuscripts of a European country, Switzerland in that case, available on the internet. Though they later have went on to different software solutions. That came out of the other things. That's a quote of Peter Robinson in 2005, which basically said, well, sometime at the change of the millennia, we had all these wonderful second generation digital editions, and where are they? Actually, he noticed that in the late 90s and at about the turn of the millennium, it was much easier to consider one of the prestigious publishing houses to publish one of these second generation digital editions than it was 5 years later. And as I have said, I found it very interesting that some of the solutions which I presented seem to have been more or less erased from the collective memory of specialists of digital editions. Well, let's be a little bit less personal about the third generation, but let me emphasize this personal view that what happened with the third generation, which of course we have in the meantime identified as the internet, the sheer availability of a medium in which you could have the material available more or less crashed attempts to do something more sophisticated. What the third generation is about is moving paradigms which have been developed in the earlier generations to the new medium. Though I have to admit that the various paradigms which I've tried to describe from the second generation seem not to have changed all that much. I think on all of these you could still submit papers today and be considered highly original if you have a working solution for them. There's one important difference. One of the reasons which led to the despair of Peter is that all the printed editions have exactly one user interface. A printed book, the structure of which you understand very well, at least after some academic training. While all of these second generation digital editions had one thing in common. You had to learn their own presentation system. For Peter you had to buy a Mac, and for everybody else you had to get into the intrinsic of a specific presentation interface and presentation software, which as far as I'm concerned has governed the work of a third generation of digital editions, redo everything of that, but fit it into exactly, as far as I'm a humanist, I'm a historian who's interested in the final research product. Research happens something like this. Custodians preserve something, editors reconstruct the true text, researchers interpret it, and, well, finally, that's for what all of us are paid ultimately. That has been the case, and the relationship between editors and other participants in the process by which academic results are created, which has been in force for, well, at least 100, probably something like 200 years. It has only one problem. And that may be the reason that editorial studies, who seem to be on the upswing again, at least among historians, have been heavily discredited during the last 30 years. I may remind you that there's not a single department of Hilfswissenschaften which for about 150 years have been the hallmark of German historical, the German version of historical studies, which has survived the last 10 years. The reason may be connected to that because in many ways historical research became much more dynamic. Dynamic also in the sense that the focus of historians, which types of sources are important, shifts every 10 or 15 years. So sometimes we discover that sociology is a great thing, we are suddenly becoming interested in certain administrative papers. We discover that anthropology may be very useful. We want to have narratives from the archives which nobody ever looked at before, and we need them immediately, which is not very useful if it takes you 60 years to get the results out of the discovery of a new type of source. The significance of this third generation I very much see in a model where all of these people do it immediately. Because even if you do nothing but put the naked manuscripts onto a place where everybody can use it, like for example the internet, well, editors can start reconstructing the true text, but at the end of the day, researchers can use them as they are. They may understand them slightly, and you would be very astonished if you would read some of the reports of totally and provably untrained laymen, what nice kind of experiences they have looking into one of these resources. The nice thing about doing that in a dynamic environment where you have all of these conceptual layers available at the same time is, of course, that this can happen also in parallel. The nice thing is that the green stuff happens, the red is less fascinating. However, the red part, when you work in the print paradigm, stays for the next 20 years. There are very, very, very few historical books which are published more frequently than every 20 years or so. If you work in a dynamic environment, that becomes possible. Okay, that would be my interpretation of the third generation of digital editions, which, as far as I see, is in the medium of the web, more or less approaching the same state of the art as the second generation has been on the static medium before. The difference is this has a much wider impact, because this time we are targeting one unified medium with which everybody has experience, even if he or she has not read any, has read nothing about this specific type of content before. There's one problem, however. The tools for creating the editions are just as heterogeneous forever, as ever. Which is maybe one of the reasons why, while we have relatively clear ideas how to represent things in the digital medium of the internet, there's absolutely no agreement what tools we need to produce them. Let's face it, the TEI is a wonderful invention, but in the year 1983, what he had to do to work with humanities texts was to invent a coding scheme, and then you had to find a clever physics student who made the whole thing work. After 30 years of standardizing in coding, what you have to do is that you have to conceptualize the TEI in all its splendor of something like 2,000 pages. When you do that, you invent a coding scheme, and then you try to find a clever physics student who understands how to handle the tools which you need to make any sense out of it. So while the presentation has made an enormous jump forward, with the tools we have the same problems as before. Now, this may be a bit too short. I may have been too involved in infrastructure discussions recently, but I would say that there are currently two problems. There are some people who promise that with integrated national infrastructures for tools, for example, TextGrid in Germany, these problems will be solved. Only problem, they are so complex that if you're not part of the original development team, your chances really to add to them are slightly above zero, but very slightly so. Which is the reason why I find the inter-edition approach is extremely interesting, because they focus very much more on the interoperability of tools instead of the framework in which they should operate, which is a reason why I consider it extremely interesting. Well, on the other hand, I'm too closely connected to computer science not to see that there's a couple of pitfalls, because this notion of easily interacting software components is simply not as far advanced as it should be. As I said, a very, very, very long start for a very, very brief finish. Currently, a new medium takes over at exactly the same speed as the internet has been taking over roughly 20 to 18 years ago. interesting thing is it's much more ubiquitous, even more ubiquitous than the traditional PC. You have it with you not only in the archive, you also have it also with you in the train when you go to and from the archive. And the interesting thing is that the medium as such looks much more traditional than a PC. That's very interesting. When we had the first systems for text processing, for word processing, the first documents of everybody who encountered a word processor in the early 80s looked the same. At least 5 types of fonts, 3 colors, and 7 different sizes of print. And very, very slowly, we discovered that there was actually a reason why you normally wouldn't do that with traditional print media. And it took about something like 10 years or so to discover what really was useful in the new medium and what was not. Exactly the same thing happened with the internet. If you look at some of the pages from the early 90s, you have exactly the same explosion of fonts, colors, sizes, and other things again. The very, very interesting thing is that if you look at a Kindle or something like that, it's absolutely minimalist. There's none of this kind of fancy nonsense anymore, but we're really concentrating back on the text. And on the other hand, the whole idea of using these tiny devices works only if the tools which operate on them, apps and their relatives, are incomparably more interoperable as anything which exists on a PC today. Therefore, my thesis for the development would be that the 4th generation of digital editions, which somehow will appear during the next 10 to 15 years, will, as far as the text is concerned, probably look strikingly like a relatively plain text. The question whether this is traditional or digital enhanced or something will basically be whether a user is willing to use the more hidden levels which you have activated intentionally to go beyond the original text. On the technical side, I hope that we will be able to share tools much more. That is, we rethink the idea of editorial systems into collections of editorial components which are as small as possible, which can interact between different projects, which has some implications which are not so much interesting for a discussion of digital editions, but for the discussions of the kind of infrastructures we need. The following is not to be taken completely serious. That's just a student's work of a seminar I had last summer. That's a version of Grotefend, which basically allows you to convert between the various types of chronological style. But personally, I think it might not be such a bad idea if I find myself sitting in an archive and instead of having to carry around Capelli, Grotefend and the 10 closest relatives, I simply might have 10 different apps which encapsulate that. Thank you very much indeed.